Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really significant and, let's face it, pretty controversial issue, the idea of a potential federal ban on pornography in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a big one. And we've gathered quite a range of sources to try and, navigate this complex topic.
Exactly. We've got a YouTube discussion looking at the implications of banning, well, what people online often call corn. Then there are some insightful articles from Them Magazine and News Nation, which really detail a proposed bill and the whole Project 2025 agenda.
Right, and we also looked at some online discussions, specifically from the Rask Trump supporters and Radical Voice off-topic subreddits. Gives you a sense of the public and legal angles people are considering.
So our mission here really is to get past the sort of surface-level noise.
Yeah, to really understand the specifics. What's actually in this proposed law? What are the arguments for and against it? What could actually happen if it passed?
And just get a feel for the different viewpoints, because there are definitely quite a few on this one. Okay, so let's start by digging into the legislation itself. It's called the Interstate Obscenity Definition Act, or IOD.
That's right, IOD. It's being pushed by Utah Senator Mike Lee, and he's got support from Illinois Representative Mary Miller. It's actually his third attempt trying to get this through, apparently.
Third time's the charm, maybe. So what's the core aim? What's it trying to change?
Fundamentally, IOD wants to rewrite the definition of obscenity in the old Communications Act of 1934. And the new definition they're proposing is, well, it's broad.
How broad are we talking?
Okay, so it defines obscene as anything that first appeals to the prurient interest in nudity, sex, or excretion. Second, it depicts, describes, or represents an actual or simulated sexual act, basically with the objective intent to arouse, titillate, or gratify sexual desires.
Okay.
And third, and this is crucial, it lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. That's the SLAPS test acronym you sometimes hear.
Right, the SLAPS test. But even just hearing that, it sounds like a pretty major change from how obscenity law works now.
Oh, it absolutely is. The really big departure is how it deals with the current standard, the Miller test, which comes from a 1973 Supreme Court case, Miller v. California.
Remind us what the Miller test involves.
Sure. So under Miller, for something to be legally obscene and therefore not protected by the First Amendment, it has to meet three criteria. It has to appeal to the prurient interest, basically, a morbid or shameful interest in sex.
Okay.
It has to be patently offensive, according to contemporary community standards. And like the IOD proposal, it has to lack serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, the SLAPS part.
So the big change with IOD is?
It proposes getting rid of the reliance on community standards and also dropping the patently offensive requirement.
Wow, okay. That feels significant. If IOD actually became law, what kind of impact are people worried about?
Well, as the Them article really emphasizes, taking out those two elements, community standards and patent offensiveness, could drastically lower the bar. It might make it much, much easier to bring legal challenges against almost any depiction of sexual activity.
Any depiction? That sounds incredibly wide-ranging.
It could be. We're talking visual stuff, maybe even written material. Groups like the Future of Free Speech have called IOD dangerous precisely because moving away from those local community standards could effectively create a single national standard for obscenity.
And that national standard might be much more restrictive than what many communities currently accept, right?
Exactly. It might not reflect the diverse values across the country at all.
Now, you mentioned this isn't happening in a vacuum. Our sources connect this IOD bill to Project 2025. Can you unpack that link a bit?
Yeah, Project 2025, it's basically this huge policy roadmap put together by conservative groups, with the Heritage Foundation being a major player.
Yeah.
It outlines what they'd like to see happen in a potential second Trump administration.
And both them and News Nation see a direct line between IOData and what Project 2025 says about porn.
A very clear line. Project 2025's stance is quite blunt.
Blunt how?
Their documents explicitly state pornography should be outlawed. Full stop.
Just outlaw.
Yep. And their recommendations go further. They suggest imprisoning producers and distributors and even shutting down companies that, facilitate its distribution, presumably platforms, maybe payment processors, that kind of thing.
It's a very aggressive approach. And the Them article mentions something particularly concerning about how this intersects with views on transgender people.
Yes, that's a really critical and, frankly, disturbing part of it. Project 2025 makes this a highly controversial link. It essentially lumps in transgender ideology and sexualization of children as manifestations of pornography.
Wow, so they're conflating gender identity with obscenity.
It appears so. And even more alarmingly, they suggest that educators and librarians who provide materials they deem pornographic, and given the context, that could easily include books with LGBTQ plus themes or characters, should be registered as sex offenders.
Okay, that definitely raises huge red flags about free expression, censorship, and targeting specific groups. Let's shift slightly. What are the arguments for this kind of ban, as presented in the sources we looked at?
Well, the YouTube transcript and the News Nation piece touch on this.
Yeah.
A main driver seems to be protecting children. There's a concern about how easily kids can access what proponents call destructive material online.
Right, the accessibility argument.
Exactly. There's also a belief expressed that pornography itself contributes to sort of societal decay, immorality, maybe even things like erectile dysfunction or desensitization towards sex and relationships.
So framing it as a moral issue, a public health issue almost.
Kind of. It's often framed as restoring order, controlling perceived immorality. The speaker in that YouTube clip had an interesting point, comparing the ease of online access now to the, quote, walk of shame someone might have felt going into an adult video store back in the day.
Implying that friction, that social barrier, acted as a kind of deterrent that's now gone.
Precisely. That's the idea, bringing back some kind of social or practical barrier.
Interesting analogy. Okay, but let's flip it. What about the counter-arguments, the major concerns about a bill like IOD?
There are quite a few, and they're pretty fundamental. The Them article and legal experts quoted by News Nation really hammer the First Amendment issue, free speech.
The classic conflict.
Absolutely. Historically, defining obscene pornography in a way that doesn't violate the Constitution has been incredibly tricky. There's a real fear that this broad definition in IOD could easily be used to suppress a whole range of expression that isn't what most people think of as, hardcore porn.
And given that Project 2025 language we discussed, the fear that it could be used to target LGBTQ plus people and content seems, well, pretty rational.
Extremely rational. Removing community standards is key here. The worry is that you end up with a national standard dictated by the values of one particular group, which could then be weaponized against transgender people or LGBTQ plus content more broadly, just by labeling it obscene.
Okay, so that covers the bill and the big arguments. It's always useful to see what regular folks are saying.
Yeah.
What came up in the Ask Trump Supporters subreddit discussions?
It was interesting. There was actually a fair bit of skepticism there. Many posters doubted whether Trump himself would really make banning porn a top priority, or if he even could do it unilaterally.
So questioning the political will or the actual power to do it.
Yeah, recognizing it might be beyond presidential power. Project 2025 was often viewed as more of a think tank's wish list, not necessarily Trump's guaranteed playbook if he were reelected.
So was there any support for related ideas?
Some. There's definitely some openness to stricter age verification laws for accessing adult content online. The child protection argument seemed to resonate there. And the influence of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025 itself was definitely debated. How much real sway did these groups have? Opinions varied.
So a mix, but maybe leaning towards a full ban seems unlikely or difficult. What about the legal folks over at And Legal Advice Off Topic? They'd have a different lens.
They certainly did.
Yeah.
People there were raising practical legal questions, like what happens to old inactive accounts on certain websites if porn suddenly becomes illegal? Could you be liable for something you accessed years ago?
Interesting point.
But overall, there was also a lot of skepticism about a blanket ban actually happening. People brought up the Supreme Court's past decisions protecting some forms of pornography, especially back in the 70s.
Although they also acknowledged the current court might see things differently.
Exactly. That was part of the discussion. Could this conservative court revisit those precedents? But even then, there were doubts. A key question was, would a ban target users or just distributors and producers? That makes a huge legal difference.
Right.
People also noted the irony. Given past failed attempts to regulate online content like CDA or COPA back in the day, and significantly, there was real doubt expressed about whether even this Supreme Court would uphold a total ban given the First Amendment implications. Plus, the massive challenge of simply defining pornographic in a legally sound way, especially for content that isn't explicitly graphic.
It sounds like the legal and practical hurdles are just enormous.
They really are. It's not a simple thing to legislate or enforce.
And you mentioned there's a sort of broader political context here.
Definitely.
Yeah.
This IOD bill isn't an isolated incident. It fits into a larger conservative pushback against what they define as obscenity, We're seeing parallel efforts in various states, mostly focused on age verification laws for accessing adult sites.
So it's part of a wider trend?
A wider trend, yeah. And this whole debate really throws into sharp relief that ongoing tension in American society. Where do you draw the line between government regulation of online content, protecting vulnerable people, and safeguarding individual freedoms and free speech? It's a recurring theme, and attempts to ban porn outright have a long, generally unsuccessful history.
So as our listeners trying to process all of this, what are the key takeaways? It feels like there are no easy answers here.
I think that's the main takeaway, the sheer complexity. You've got this fundamental clash between the constitutional right to free expression and very real societal concerns about potential harms, especially to kids.
Right.
Then you have massive legal challenges in just defining what you're trying to ban, let alone enforcing it effectively. Add to that deeply different cultural views on what the government should or shouldn't be involved in when it comes to online content and personal choices.
And the practicalities in the internet age just seem immense.
Immense. So ultimately, it forces you, the listener, to really think critically about where those lines should be drawn. And importantly, what are the potential unintended consequences of drawing them too broadly with legislation like this?
Absolutely. Well, that feels like a good place to wrap up this deep dive. It certainly gives us a lot to think about.
It does. And perhaps a final thought for you to consider. Given this long history and the ongoing tension between liberty and societal values, how should we navigate regulating online content? How do we balance free expression with addressing genuine concerns about harm, especially to children or other vulnerable groups?
Yeah.
And maybe think about this. Are there non-legal approaches? Social strategies, educational initiatives, better tools for parents, things that might be more effective or at least less problematic than trying to implement outright government bans.